Japanese POWs in Wisconsin were served white rice. But why did they think it was a death row meal? September 1944. Deep in the heart of the American Midwest, far from the sulphurous stench of Iwo Jima or the humid jungles of Burma, a train hissed to a halt at a secluded siding near McCoy, Wisconsin. On board were hundreds of men in tattered, salt-crusted uniforms of the Imperial Japanese Army. They were the ghost soldiers, men who, according to the Bushido Code, were already dead to their families and their emperor because they had committed the ultimate sin. They had been captured alive. As the heavy wooden doors of the transport cars creaked open, the crisp, cool air of the driftless area rushed in, a sharp contrast to the stifling holds of the Liberty ships that had carried them across the Pacific. These men of the Japanese 18th and 32nd Divisions expected execution. They expected the brutality they had been told the Americans dealt to their captives. But as they were marched toward the gates of Camp McCoy, a strange aroma began to waft through the barbed wire, a scent that should have been a comfort, but instead struck terror into their hearts. By 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned into a relentless American deluge. From the bloody beaches of Saipan to the nightmare of the Aleutians, Japanese soldiers found themselves cut off, starved, and under-equipped. For the average Japanese infantryman, or gunto, surrender was not an option discussed in training. The Senjin-kun, field service code, was clear. Do not suffer the disgrace of being captured alive. However, as the island-hopping campaign intensified, thousands of Japanese soldiers, many wounded, unconscious, or simply too exhausted to trigger a final grenade, fell into American hands. The U.S. Army faced a logistical and psychological challenge. Where do you put men who believe they have no right to exist? The answer lay in the rolling hills of Monroe County, Wisconsin. Camp McCoy was transformed into one of the largest prisoner-of-war installations in the United States. While it initially housed German and Italian prisoners, the arrival of the Japanese presented a unique cultural friction. These were men like Sergeant Takahashi and Private Ishii, fictionalized composites of the real men held there, who arrived at McCoy convinced that every act of American kindness was a calculated psychological torture. By 1400 hours on a Tuesday in late October, the new intake of 500 Japanese prisoners had been processed. They were stripped, deloused, and given surplus U.S. denim fatigues marked with a large PW on the back. To the Japanese, the letters felt like a brand of shame. As the sun began to dip behind the Wisconsin pines, the prisoners were moved into Block 4. The tension was palpable. American guards, armed with M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns, watched from the towers. The guards were mostly Midwestern boys, farmers and mechanics who had never seen a Japanese person before this moment. They saw the prisoners' stoic, downward-cast eyes as a sign of simmering aggression. The prisoners, meanwhile, interpreted every detail through the lens of propaganda. They saw the cleanliness of the barracks not as comfort, but sterile preparation for a clinical mass execution. They noticed the Americans were well-fed, carrying heavy belts of ammunition. Then came the order for dinner. In the mess hall, the Army cooks had made a special effort. Recognizing that the Japanese diet relied heavily on rice, the Quartermaster Corps had secured several hundred pounds of high-quality, short-grain white rice. In the 1940s, polished white rice was a luxury in war-torn Japan, reserved for the wealthy or for special ceremonies. As the prisoners lined up, steam from the large industrial pots rose into the rafters. The smell was unmistakable. It was the scent of home. But for Private Ishii and his comrades, the sight of gleaming white grains didn't bring hunger. It brought a cold, paralyzing dread. What happened next would become legendary in the annals of Camp McCoy. As the first trays were slid across the counter, loaded with mountain-sized portions of pure white rice, a hush fell over the mess hall. No one ate. The prisoners stood frozen, their eyes darting between the food and the guards. In Japanese military tradition, and specifically in the folklore of the era, a meal of pure white rice, without the usual stretching of barley or millet, was associated with the last meal. It was the meal served to a condemned man, before he was led to the gallows or the firing squad. To these men who already felt they were living on borrowed time, the white rice was confirmation. The Americans were going to kill them tonight.
Fear gripped the men. One prisoner dropped his tray, the clatter of metal on concrete sounding like a gunshot. The American guards shifted their weapons, fingers tightening on triggers. They didn't understand why the prisoners were trembling at the sight of food. "Eat," the guards commanded, gesturing toward the plates. The prisoners looked at one another. Some began to weep silently. They believed the rice was poisoned, or that it was the final gift before a massacre. The language barrier was an abyss. The Americans thought they were being generous. The Japanese thought they were being sized up for the grave. For 20 minutes, 500 men sat in total silence before untouched plates. The air was thick with the scent of starch and the metallic tang of sweat. A single spark, a misunderstood shout, or a sudden movement could have triggered a bloodbath in the middle of Wisconsin. The turning point came not through a command, but through a moment of human intuition. Colonel Rogers was called to the mess hall. He stood at the front of the room, looking at the pale faces of the prisoners. He had studied Japanese culture briefly, but it was a Nisei interpreter, Sergeant Kenji Goto, who realized the source of the terror. Goto stepped forward, his U.S. Army uniform a stark contrast to the prisoners' denim. He spoke in rapid Japanese, calm but firm. "This is not a death meal," Goto explained. "In America, we have plenty. This rice is not a sacrifice. It is simply dinner." To prove it, Sergeant Goto took a bowl of rice. Using improvised chopsticks, he ate a large mouthful in front of everyone. He invited the American guards to do the same. One by one, the cooks began eating the food they had prepared. The prisoners watched, mesmerized. One older Japanese NCO, a veteran of the Manchurian campaign, tentatively picked up a grain of rice and tasted it. It wasn't poisoned, it wasn't ritual, it was just rice. Relief swept the room like a physical wave. The men began to eat, first slowly, then with desperate ferocity. They weren't just eating rice, they were consuming the realization that they might survive the war. By the end of the war, Camp McCoy had housed over 2,700 Japanese prisoners. The white rice incident became a case study in cultural intelligence. The camp changed its approach. Many of the prisoners became cooperative. They formed a camp band, played baseball with guards, and carved intricate artwork from scrap lumber. When the war ended in August 1945, many were afraid to return home. They feared shame. But the humane treatment they received, symbolized by that first meal, convinced them that a new Japan was possible. Only 5 Japanese prisoners died at Camp McCoy, mostly from natural causes. Colonel Rogers received commendations. The Nisei interpreters were later recognized for preventing tragedy. Today, the site is quiet, but the story remains. A reminder that even in global war, a simple bowl of rice can bridge the gap between enemies. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to Past History Tales as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.